In the forgotten hollows of the Unicoi Mountains, where Tennessee mist clings to ancient trees and silent swallows screams, there existed a place where 17 women simply vanished. The year was 1904. Two brothers ran a trading post 15 miles from civilization: Ephraim, the charming merchant everyone trusted, and Silas, his silent shadow. Travelers spoke of their hospitality. Families praised their generosity. But beneath their homestead, something waited in the darkness. When a schoolteacher's boot surfaced in the spring thaw, one determined deputy refused to accept the mountain's secrets. What he discovered hidden in their floors, what investigators found chained in their cellar, what a 5-page confession finally revealed, these truths were so disturbing that locals speak of it in whispers even today. How did respected men become monsters? What drove them to build what they called their breeding cellar? And what made a brother finally confess to 6 years of unthinkable evil? The justice that followed was swift and final, but the methods— prepare yourself for what's coming next, because what happened in that hollow will leave you terrified. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if you're brave enough for this journey. Subscribe so you don't miss stories that reveal the darkest corners of human nature. The spring of 1904 arrived late in the Unicoi Mountains, the winter's grip finally releasing its hold on the remote hollows of Monroe County, Tennessee. On the morning of March 17th, a farmer named Jacob Merrill was checking his creekside traps when he noticed something lodged against a fallen log where the ice had melted. It was a woman's boot, leather, worn but well made, the kind a schoolteacher might wear. Merrill recognized it immediately because he'd seen Eleanor Vance wearing those exact boots 6 months earlier, on the day she'd walked past his property heading toward the Backwoods trading post to purchase supplies before disappearing into the mountains. The boot shouldn't have been there. Miss Vance had supposedly left the hollow to take a teaching position in Knoxville. That's what everyone believed. That's what Ephraim Blackwood had told them. Deputy Sheriff Arlen Hayes arrived at the creek by midday, summoned by a rider Merrill had sent to the county seat. Hayes was a methodical man of 47, an outsider assigned to the mountain communities 3 years prior, still viewed with suspicion by locals who valued mountain justice over paperwork and procedure. He examined the boot carefully, noting the initials E.V. carved faintly into the inner sole, a detail Miss Vance's sister would later confirm in sworn testimony as Eleanor's habit for identifying her belongings. The leather showed no signs of animal damage, no tearing that would suggest it had been lost naturally while crossing rough terrain. It had simply been discarded, thrown away like refuse, and the creek's current had carried it downstream from somewhere higher in the mountains. Hayes stood at that creek bank and understood with cold certainty that Eleanor Vance had never made it to Knoxville. She had never left the hollow at all. The deputy's investigation notes from that afternoon, preserved in the Monroe County archives, reveal his immediate suspicion. Miss Vance had last been seen purchasing traveling supplies from Ephraim Blackwood's trading post, the only commercial establishment within 20 miles. Ephraim had been the one to explain her sudden departure, claiming she'd mentioned homesickness and purchased a train ticket through him to return east. But Hayes had learned to distrust convenient explanations in isolated places where a man's word could become gospel simply because no one dared question it. He spent the next 2 days quietly asking questions, and with each conversation, the pattern grew more disturbing. A mail-order bride named Catherine Dupree had arrived at the nearest train station 9 months earlier, purchased supplies from Blackwood, and vanished before reaching her intended groom's homestead 15 miles north. A widow named Sarah Kemp had inquired about purchasing land from the Blackwood brothers 2 years prior and was never heard from again. Each disappearance had a reasonable explanation. Each explanation came from Ephraim Blackwood. On March 20th, Hayes made the 15-mile ride to the Blackwood homestead, ostensibly to ask routine questions about Miss Vance's last known movements. The property sat in a nameless hollow, accessible only by a single wagon trail that became impassable during heavy rains, effectively cutting it off from the outside world for months at a time. Ephraim greeted him with practiced warmth, offering coffee and expressing genuine-sounding concern about the missing schoolteacher. He was clean-shaven and well-spoken, his cabin neat and orderly, nothing about his demeanor suggesting anything but honest hospitality. His brother Silas watched from the doorway, silent and imposing, before disappearing into the timber yard without a word. Ephraim explained that Miss Vance had seemed troubled, that she'd mentioned the isolation was too much for a city-bred woman, that he'd tried to talk her into staying through the spring term, but she'd been determined to leave. It was a good story. It might have been believed if Hayes hadn't noticed the procurement ledger sitting open on Ephraim's desk. The ledger was where Blackwood recorded all his business transactions, a thick volume bound in black leather with entries dating back 6 years. Hayes asked if he might review the records of Miss Vance's purchases, a reasonable request that Ephraim couldn't refuse without arousing suspicion. As he flipped through the pages, Hayes's trained eye caught something that made his blood run cold. Between legitimate entries for lumber sales and grain purchases were notations that seemed out of place. Next to a date in October 1903, an entry read, E.V. Arrived, supplies advanced, silver brush, $12 in script. The date matched Eleanor Vance's last confirmed sighting. 3 pages earlier, August 1903. CD, supplies, wedding band, gold, $23 in personal effects. Catherine Dupree, the mail-order bride. Further back, May 1902. S.K., land inquiry, spectacles, pearl brooch, $47 debit. Sarah Kemp, the widow. Each entry was followed months later by a single word in Ephraim's precise handwriting, settled. Hayes kept his expression neutral as he copied down Miss Vance's supply list, thanked Ephraim for his time, and rode back toward town with evidence that would change everything. That ledger wasn't just a record of business transactions. It was a catalog of acquisitions, a meticulous accounting of women who had entered the hollow and the valuables they'd carried with them. The word settled appeared beside entries for at least 9 different women over the span of 6 years, each one coded by initials, each one followed by an itemized list of personal effects that should have left the hollow with their owners but apparently hadn't. The pattern wasn't just suspicious, it was damning. But Hayes knew that pattern alone wouldn't be enough. Mountain communities protected their own, and Ephraim Blackwood was considered a pillar of this isolated society. Hayes needed more than a clerk's suspicions and a coded ledger. He needed proof that couldn't be explained away by Blackwood's charisma and the community's willingness to believe in him. That night, Hayes wrote his first official report documenting the discovery of Eleanor Vance's boot and the suspicious entries in Blackwood's ledger. He noted the disappearances of at least 3 other women, all last seen at the trading post, all explained away by the same trusted source. The report concluded with a single recommendation that would set the machinery of justice in motion: a formal investigation into the business practices and property of Ephraim and Silas Blackwood. The document sits in the county archives to this day, Hayes's careful handwriting laying the foundation for what would become one of Tennessee's most horrifying murder cases. One missing schoolteacher had seemed like tragic misfortune. 3 missing women looked like coincidence. 9 coded entries in a ledger, each marking a woman who vanished after trusting the wrong merchant, revealed something far darker. The hollow was hiding a secret, and that secret had a body count. Deputy Hayes understood that confronting Ephraim Blackwood directly would be suicide for his investigation. The man was beloved in the hollow, trusted implicitly, and any accusation without ironclad proof would be dismissed as the paranoid suspicions of an outsider who didn't understand mountain ways. More troubling, Hayes couldn't trust the local community to keep his investigation quiet. Too many families depended on Blackwood's credit and goodwill, and word of official scrutiny would spread faster than he could build his case. So on March 23rd, Hayes made a decision that would prove crucial to exposing the truth. He rode 30 miles southwest to Chattanooga, leaving the mountains behind to search for evidence in the city's commercial records, far from Blackwood's influence and the hollow's protective silence. The Chattanooga Commerce District maintained shipping manifests for all goods transported into the mountain regions, a bureaucratic necessity that Hayes had learned to appreciate during his 3 years as deputy. For 2 days he sat in a cramped records office reviewing invoices and delivery receipts, cross-referencing dates with the entries in Blackwood's ledger. What he discovered transformed suspicion into certainty. Between 1,898 and 1,904, Ephraim Blackwood had purchased, through various suppliers, over 1,200 pounds of lye. The chemical was commonly used for soap making and leather tanning, but the quantity was staggering for a small trading post operation. A typical tannery might use 200 pounds annually. Blackwood had been ordering that amount every single year, sometimes more, far exceeding any legitimate business need his operation could justify. The receipts were signed, dated, and filed with meticulous bureaucratic precision, creating a paper trail that couldn't be denied or explained away. But the lye purchases were only the beginning of what Hayes uncovered in those dusty records. Between the chemical orders were requisitions for heavy iron chains, the kind used for logging operations or securing livestock, purchased in quantities that made no sense for a man whose timber business employed only his brother. 3 separate orders for manacles and locks, items with no agricultural purpose whatsoever, had been shipped to the Blackwood trading post between 1,899 and 1,902. Hayes copied every invoice, every delivery confirmation, every signature, building a documentary record that painted a picture of preparation and intent. These weren't impulsive purchases. They were the systematic acquisition of tools designed for one purpose: restraint. The evidence suggested that whatever was happening in that hollow had been planned, funded, and supplied through legitimate commercial channels, hidden in plain sight among ordinary business transactions. On his 3rd day in Chattanooga, Hayes tracked down the man whose signature appeared on most of the receipts. Samuel Cobb was a traveling salesman of 54 years, a weathered man who had spent 2 decades selling hardware and chemicals to the remote trading posts of East Tennessee. He remembered the Blackwood brothers well, though his memory carried an undercurrent of unease that Hayes immediately recognized. Cobb agreed to provide a sworn statement, and the deposition he gave on March 27, 1904, preserved in the Monroe County Court records, would become one of the prosecution's most damning pieces of evidence. Cobb testified that he had personally delivered lye to the Blackwood homestead twice yearly for 6 consecutive years, each delivery consisting of at least 100 pounds of the caustic chemical. When he'd questioned the quantity during his 3rd delivery in 1900, Ephraim had explained it was for tanning deer hides, a reasonable explanation that Cobb had accepted without further inquiry. But there was something else Cobb remembered, a detail that had troubled him for years without understanding why. During his visits to the Blackwood property, he had never seen a tannery, never smelled the distinctive reek of leather processing, never observed any evidence of the large-scale hide operation that would justify such massive lye consumption. More disturbing was his description of Silas Blackwood, the silent brother who had occasionally helped unload the chemical barrels. Cobb's statement described Silas as unnaturally quiet, watching with eyes that held no human warmth, moving with the careful precision of a man used to handling dangerous things. On one occasion in 1902, Cobb had noticed scratches on Silas's forearms, deep gouges that looked like they'd been made by human fingernails. When asked about them, Silas had simply walked away without responding, leaving Ephraim to smooth over the awkward moment with easy charm and an offer of whiskey. Armed with commercial receipts and Cobb's testimony, Hayes returned to Monroe County on March 30th with enough evidence to request a search warrant. But he made one more stop before approaching the county judge. The Kemp family lived 12 miles east of the Hollow, and Hayes wanted to confirm the details of Sarah Kemp's disappearance before moving forward. What he learned from Sarah's brother, Daniel Kemp, added another layer of horror to the emerging picture. Daniel's testimony, recorded in Hayes's investigation notes, revealed that Sarah had traveled to the Blackwood property in May 1902 with $800 in cash, her late husband's life savings, intending to purchase 20 acres of mountain land. Ephraim had written her several letters preserved by the family and later entered as evidence, describing available parcels and promising fair prices. Sarah had been a capable, careful woman of 38, not prone to foolish decisions or impulsive departures. She had told her family she would return within 3 days to finalize the purchase with their family lawyer present. 3 days became a week, then a month. When Daniel rode to the Blackwood homestead to inquire, Ephraim expressed surprise and concern, claiming Sarah had looked at the land, decided the isolation wasn't suitable for a woman alone, and left to catch the eastbound train. He'd even offered to accompany her to the station, he said, but she'd insisted on traveling alone, apparently embarrassed by her change of heart. It was a plausible story delivered with convincing sincerity, and Daniel had believed it until months passed without any word from his sister. Letters sent to her last known addresses in Virginia went unanswered. Inquiries with the railroad produced no record of a ticket purchased in her name. Sarah Kemp had simply vanished, and the $800 she'd carried had vanished with her. Daniel's statement concluded with a detail that made Hayes's investigation suddenly urgent. Sarah had been wearing a pearl brooch, a family heirloom, when she left. The same pearl brooch that appeared as an entry in Blackwood's ledger under the initials S.K. with a value of $47. On April 2, 1904, Deputy Sheriff Arlen Hayes presented his evidence to Circuit Judge William Thorne. The case he laid out was methodical and devastating. Coded ledger entries matching missing women, commercial receipts proving the purchase of chemicals and restraints far exceeding any legitimate need, sworn testimony from a credible witness documenting 6 years of suspicious transactions, and the confirmed disappearance of a woman carrying a specific piece of jewelry that appeared in Blackwood's accounting records. Judge Thorne reviewed the evidence for 2 hours before signing the search warrant, noting in his judicial order that the documented facts presented probable cause to believe that serious crimes have been committed and that evidence of said crimes may be found upon the premises of Ephraim and Silas. Blackwood. The warrant authorized a complete search of the homestead, all outbuildings, and the surrounding property within a half-mile radius. It also granted Hayes the authority to seize any records, personal effects, or physical evidence related to the missing women. The machinery of justice, slow to start in the isolated mountains, was now in motion, and it would not stop until the truth was fully exposed. Deputy Hayes arrived at the Blackwood homestead on the morning of April 5, 1904, accompanied by 2 deputies from the county seat and a local magistrate to witness the search. The presence of law enforcement traveling together was unusual enough to draw attention, and word had already spread through the hollow that something was happening at the Blackwood property. Ephraim met them at the door with his characteristic calm, reading the warrant with apparent bemusement before stepping aside to grant them entry. His only comment, recorded in Hayes's official report, was delivered with a slight smile. "You won't find anything improper here, Deputy. My brother and I run an honest business." That confidence would prove to be his fatal miscalculation. The cabin was exactly as Hayes remembered from his first visit, neat, orderly, almost Spartanly furnished. The main room contained a table, 4 chairs, a wood stove, and Ephraim's desk with the infamous ledger still sitting in plain view. 2 smaller rooms served as bedrooms, each containing a single bed frame and a trunk for personal belongings. The search of these spaces yielded nothing suspicious. Kitchen implements were standard, clothing was worn but well maintained. Even the desk drawers contained only routine business correspondence and financial records that seemed perfectly legitimate. After 2 hours of methodical searching, the deputies had found no physical evidence connecting the Blackwood brothers to any crime. The local magistrate was beginning to show signs of impatience, clearly uncomfortable with what appeared to be harassment of respected community members. Hayes could feel his case slipping away with each empty drawer and innocent discovery. It was Deputy Marcus Webb, the younger of the 2 county deputies, who noticed the discrepancy. Webb had been examining the cabin's construction, noting the age of the timbers and the quality of the craftsmanship, when he realized that the floor didn't match. Most of the floorboards were weathered oak, darkened by years of foot traffic and age, their surfaces worn smooth. But a section near the center of the main room, approximately 4 feet square, consisted of newer pine boards that hadn't yet acquired the patina of the surrounding wood. The replacement was subtle enough to escape casual notice, but obvious to someone looking for inconsistencies. Webb knelt beside the section and pressed down, feeling the boards flex slightly, differently than the solid oak around them. Hayes ordered the boards removed immediately, and what that decision revealed would transform the investigation from suspicion into certainty. Beneath the newer floorboards was a cavity dug into the earth, roughly 3 feet deep and lined with canvas to protect its contents from moisture. Inside that hidden space sat a large cedar chest, the kind typically used for storing family heirlooms or a bride's trousseau. The chest was locked, but the lock was simple, and Hayes had it open within minutes. The smell that emerged was not decay but cedar and old perfume, a domestic scent that made what the chest contained even more horrifying. Inside, arranged with disturbing care, were the personal belongings of women who had never left the hollow. The inventory Hayes recorded in his evidence log that afternoon would later be read aloud in court, each item a testament to a life ended and a victim forgotten. The first items removed were 3 wedding rings, each engraved with initials and dates. One bore the inscription C, D, and J, August 1903, matching Catherine Dupree, the mail-order bride who had vanished en route to her intended husband. Beneath the rings were spectacles in a worn leather case, a woman's silver hairbrush with the initials EV engraved on the back, and a pearl brooch set in tarnished gold that Daniel Kemp would later identify through tears as the family heirloom his sister Sarah had worn. There were bundles of letters tied with ribbon, some addressed to names Hayes didn't recognize, suggesting victims beyond even his darkest estimates. A tarnished locket contained a photograph of a baby, the image faded but still visible, representing a child who would never know what happened to their mother. Each item had been carefully preserved, kept as a trophy or perhaps as a record, proof of acquisition filed away like Ephraim's meticulously kept ledger entries. But the most damning evidence in that chest was a collection of personal documents, 7 different identification papers, the kind women carried when traveling alone, each belonging to a different person. 3 train tickets, purchased but never used. A deed to property in Virginia, signed by a woman named Martha Holloway, whose name appeared in Backwoods' ledger under the date June 1901. The documents weren't just trophies. They were proof of identity, tangible evidence that specific women had been at the Blackwood property and had never left. Hayes counted the personal effects carefully, his evidence log growing longer with each discovery. When the chest was finally empty, the physical evidence represented at least 12 different women, far more than the 3 missing persons reports that had triggered his investigation. The scope of the Blackwood brothers' crimes was suddenly, horrifically clear. Ephraim Blackwood watched the chest's contents being catalogued with an expression that finally cracked, his calm facade giving way to something cold and calculating. He said nothing, offered no explanation, but Hayes noted in his report that Ephraim's hands had begun to shake, the first visible sign that the respected merchant understood his carefully constructed world was collapsing. The local magistrate, who had arrived skeptical of the search, stood pale and silent as deputy after deputy carried items from the chest to be photographed and logged. The community members who had gathered outside, initially protective of their beloved merchant, began to drift away in horrified silence as word spread about what had been found beneath Blackwood's floorboards. The discovery of the Hope Chest gave Hayes the probable cause he needed to expand the search beyond the cabin. If personal effects were being kept as trophies, then bodies were being disposed of somewhere, and the massive lie purchases suggested a method. Hayes ordered his deputies to search the outbuildings and the root cellar, a stone-lined pit dug into the hillside behind the main cabin. The cellar was where mountain families stored vegetables and preserved goods through the winter, a common feature of isolated homesteads. But the Blackwood cellar, as Hayes would discover within the hour, had been designed for a far darker purpose than food storage. Deputy Webb was the first to descend the stone steps into the cellar, carrying a lantern to illuminate the underground space. What he found caused him to immediately call for Hayes, his voice tight with barely controlled horror. The cellar was larger than expected, extending back 15 feet into the hillside with a ceiling just tall enough for a man to stand upright. The air was thick with the chemical smell of lye, so strong it burned the throat and eyes, but it was the far wall that revealed the full truth of what had happened in that hollow. Bolted directly into the stone were 3 sets of heavy iron chains, each ending in manacles designed to restrain human wrists. The stone around the bolts had been worn smooth, polished by years of friction, evidence of long-term use that made the mind recoil from imagining what had occurred in that darkness. Hayes documented every detail with the methodical precision that had defined his investigation. The chains were measured, photographed, and their origin traced back to Samuel Cobb's sales records. Scratches in the stone walls suggested desperate attempts at escape. The floor showed evidence of repeated applications of lye, the chemical having eaten into the stone itself in several places, creating pockmarks that told a story of systematic disposal. Hayes's evidence report noted that the cellar showed clear indication of having been used for the extended imprisonment and subsequent disposal of human remains, with physical modifications inconsistent with any legitimate agricultural or storage purpose. The language was clinical, legal, designed to withstand courtroom scrutiny. But every deputy who descended those steps understood they were standing in a tomb, a place where women had been kept, used, and ultimately destroyed. The search of the property continued for 3 more days, with deputies excavating areas where the soil showed signs of disturbance and where the excessive lye use might have masked decomposition. 7 sets of human remains were eventually recovered from various locations within a half-mile of the homestead, though the lye had done its work well, leaving only bones and fragments. Each discovery was documented, photographed, and carefully preserved for future identification. The forensic examination, primitive by modern standards but thorough for its time, confirmed that all 7 remains were female, their ages ranging from approximately 25 to 40 years old, based on skeletal development. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and absolutely damning. Ephraim and Silas Blackwood were arrested on April 8, 1904, charged with 7 counts of murder, and held without bail to await trial. The Monroe County Jail was a modest stone building with 6 cells, never designed to hold prisoners accused of crimes as monstrous as those the Blackwood brothers now faced. Ephraim and Silas were separated immediately upon arrest, a strategic decision by Deputy Hayes, who understood that the brothers' unity was their strength. Ephraim was placed in the cell furthest from his brother, denied any communication, while Silas occupied a cell on the opposite end of the building. For the first 3 days, both men maintained their silence. Ephraim requested a lawyer and refused to answer any questions, his composure intact despite the damning evidence accumulating against him. But Silas, cut off from his brother's guidance for the first time in his adult life, began to show signs of psychological deterioration that Hayes recognized as an opportunity. On April 11th, Hayes began a series of interrogations with Silas that would ultimately break the case wide open. The approach was methodical, designed not to threaten but to isolate and overwhelm. Hayes started by laying out the physical evidence piece by piece: the hope chest and its contents, the chains in the cellar, the skeletal remains recovered from the property, the commercial receipts proving premeditated preparation. He showed Silas photographs of the items found in the chest, asking him to identify which women they belonged to, not whether he knew them. The distinction was crucial. Hayes wasn't asking if crimes had been committed. He was establishing that Silas already knew the answers, that the guilt was shared and undeniable. Each piece of evidence was presented as fact, not accusation, creating a psychological pressure that assumed confession rather than demanded it. The breakthrough came on the 4th day of interrogation, when Hayes introduced a new element to his questioning. He brought Daniel Kemp to the jail, the brother of the murdered widow Sarah Kemp, and allowed him to identify his sister's pearl brooch through the cell bars. Daniel's grief was raw and genuine, his voice breaking as he described Sarah's excitement about starting a new life in the mountains, her careful planning, her trust in the Blackwood brothers' promises. The emotional confrontation shattered something in Silas's carefully maintained silence. When Kemp asked, through tears, what had happened to his sister, Silas responded with the first words he'd spoken since his arrest. Ephraim said she belonged to us now. He said that's how it worked in the hollow. The statement, recorded in Hayes's interrogation notes dated April 14, 1904, was the first crack in the wall of silence, and Hayes immediately recognized its significance. Over the next 2 days, Hayes carefully expanded that crack into a full confession. He separated Silas's actions from Ephraim's planning, positioning the younger brother as a follower rather than a mastermind, exploiting the psychological dynamic that had always existed between them. The technique worked because it contained truth. Silas had never been the architect of the crimes. He had been the instrument, the physical force carrying out his brother's twisted vision. On April 16th, Silas Blackwood began dictating his confession to the county clerk, a process that took nearly 6 hours and produced a 5-page document that stands as one of the most disturbing pieces of evidence in Tennessee criminal history. The confession was methodical and detailed, describing not just what had been done, but how it had been planned and executed over 6 years of systematic evil. Silas's confession, preserved in the Monroe County archives and later read in its entirety during the trial, began with the selection process. Ephraim had identified vulnerable women from his position at the trading post, women traveling alone without family connections in the area, women carrying money or valuable possessions, women who could disappear without immediate alarm. The ledger entries weren't just records of transactions, they were hunting logs, documenting prey and planning acquisition. When a suitable target was identified, Ephraim would engage them in conversation, offer assistance, sometimes extend credit or promise land sales, building trust through his respected position in the community. The women came willingly to the Blackwood property, believing they were conducting legitimate business with a respected merchant, never suspecting the isolation of the hollow had made them invisible to anyone who might protect them. The confession described the abductions with chilling clarity. Once a woman arrived at the homestead, usually alone and with no one expecting her immediate return, Silas would be waiting. His size and strength made resistance futile, and the nearest help was 15 miles away over impassable terrain. The women were taken to the root cellar, chained to the walls, kept alive for periods ranging from days to months, depending on what Silas described as Ephraim's mood and needs. The brothers operated under what Ephraim had called mountain justice, a perverse belief system that claimed ownership of everything within their hollow's boundaries. In Ephraim's twisted logic, articulated through Silas's confession, any woman who entered their land without male protection had forfeited her autonomy and become property to be tended like livestock. The ideology was documented, legally recorded, undeniable evidence that the crimes weren't crimes of passion, but of calculated belief. The disposal method was described with horrific precision in the confession. When a victim died or was killed, the body was dismembered in the cellar where the stone floor could be washed clean. The remains were then transported to various locations around the property and buried in shallow graves, each one treated with massive amounts of lye to accelerate decomposition and eliminate evidence. The lye purchases that had first raised Hayes's suspicions were explained in full. Over 1,200 pounds of caustic chemical had been used not for tanning hides but for destroying human remains, an industrial quantity applied to an industrial-scale murder operation. Silas's confession even included approximate locations of burial sites, information that allowed investigators to recover 3 additional sets of remains that hadn't been found in the initial search, bringing the confirmed victim count to 7, with strong evidence suggesting at least 10 more. But perhaps the most damning portion of Silas's confession was his description of Ephraim's record-keeping. The procurement ledger wasn't a code at all. It was exactly what it appeared to be: an accounting system where women were treated as business acquisitions, their personal effects itemized and valued, their usefulness calculated and logged. Ephraim had kept the hope chest as a physical ledger, storing proof of acquisition the same way he stored receipts and invoices. The confession revealed that Ephraim had occasionally sold items from the chest when money was tight, explaining why some of the missing women's possessions had surfaced in the trading post or at regional markets. The victims had literally been converted into merchandise, their identities erased, their lives reduced to entries in a sociopath's careful bookkeeping system. The psychological profile that emerged from Silas's confession painted Ephraim Blackwood as a man who had constructed an elaborate intellectual framework to justify monstrous acts. He had genuinely believed his family's settlement of the Hollow granted him feudal rights over everything within it. He had viewed the women not as people but as resources that had wandered into his domain, free for the taking like timber or game. The confession included several direct quotes from Ephraim that Silas had memorized over years of following orders. One statement, preserved verbatim in the legal record, captured the full horror of Ephraim's mindset. A man who tames wilderness owns everything in it. These women came to my land, seeking something from me. I simply took what they brought in fair trade for what they wanted. That's business, brother. That's how civilization works. The statement would later be read in court, demonstrating premeditation, calculated intent, and complete absence of remorse. By April 18th, Silas Blackwood's confession was complete, signed, and witnessed by 3 county officials, including Deputy Hayes and Circuit Judge Thorne. The document provided a comprehensive narrative of 6 years of systematic abduction, imprisonment, sexual assault, murder, and evidence destruction. It corroborated every piece of physical evidence already collected and pointed investigators to additional evidence they hadn't yet discovered. More importantly, it eliminated any possibility of arguing the crimes were accidental, impulsive, or anything other than deliberately planned and methodically executed. The confession sealed the brothers' fate legally, but it also served a deeper purpose. It gave voice to victims who could no longer speak for themselves, providing a record of what had been done to them and ensuring their deaths wouldn't remain mysteries buried in the mountains. Justice was no longer a possibility pending investigation. It was a certainty pending trial, and the entire machinery of the legal system was now focused on delivering it. The trial of Ephraim and Silas Blackwood began on July 11th, 1904, in the Monroe County Courthouse, a white-columned building that had never witnessed a case of such magnitude or horror. The prosecution was led by District Attorney James Thornton, a veteran prosecutor known for his methodical presentation of evidence and his ability to transform complex cases into clear narratives of guilt. The defense attorneys, appointed by the court after no local lawyer would volunteer to represent the brothers, faced an impossible task. Their clients were not just accused of murder but of systematic evil, documented through physical evidence, witness testimony, and one brother's own detailed confession. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with spectators filling every available space and dozens more gathering outside to await news of the proceedings. Thornton's opening statement lasted 40 minutes and laid out a prosecution strategy designed to eliminate any possibility of reasonable doubt. He promised the jury he would present not speculation or circumstantial evidence, but concrete proof, a procurement ledger documenting acquisitions of human beings, commercial receipts proving premeditated preparation for restraint and disposal, physical evidence recovered from a hidden chest and an underground prison, skeletal remains of 7 confirmed victims, and a signed confession describing 6 years of calculated murder. The statement concluded with a promise that echoed through the courtroom. By the time this trial concludes, you will know beyond any shadow of doubt that these men are guilty of the most heinous crimes this state has ever prosecuted, and you will have no choice but to demand the ultimate penalty. The jury, 12 men selected from outside Monroe County to ensure impartiality, listened with expressions that grew progressively more grim as Thornton detailed what evidence they would see. The first week of testimony focused on establishing the victims' identities and their connection to the Blackwood brothers. Daniel Kemp took the stand on the second day, identifying his sister Sarah's pearl brooch and describing her planned visit to purchase land from Ephraim Blackwood in May 1902. His testimony was corroborated by the letters Sarah had received from Ephraim, which were entered into evidence and read aloud in court. The letters showed Ephraim's careful cultivation of trust, his detailed descriptions of available property, his reassurances about safety and fair dealing. Cross-examination failed to shake Kemp's testimony or explain why Sarah's personal effects were found hidden beneath Ephraim's floorboards if she had simply changed her mind and left peacefully. The defense's suggestion that Sarah might have sold the brooch to Ephraim was destroyed when Thornton produced the ledger entry showing the brooch listed as a debit rather than a purchase, acquired rather than bought. Eleanor Vance's sister testified on the third day, bringing with her a collection of letters Eleanor had written during her first month's teaching in the Hollow. The letters described Ephraim Blackwood as kind and helpful, often checking on her welfare and ensuring she had adequate supplies. The final letter, dated October 15, 1903, mentioned that she would be purchasing traveling supplies from Ephraim's trading post the following week, in preparation for a trip to visit family during the winter break. She never sent another letter. Her silver hairbrush, engraved with her initials, was presented to the jury along with the boot that had been found in the creek, the discovery that had started Deputy Hayes's investigation. The defense had no explanation for why a woman who had allegedly left for Knoxville would abandon her personal possessions, particularly items of value and sentiment, in Ephraim Blackwood's hidden chest. The prosecution's presentation of physical evidence consumed the entire second week of trial. Each item from the Hope chest was cataloged, displayed to the jury, and connected to a specific missing woman through family testimony or identifying marks. 3 wedding rings, each engraved with names and dates, were matched to missing brides through church marriage records and family statements. Personal identification papers found in the chest proved that 7 different women had been at the Blackwood property, despite Ephraim's claims that most had simply passed through without stopping. The mathematical impossibility of so many personal effects being legitimately acquired was demonstrated through simple logic. Women traveling alone carried their valuables with them, and no woman would voluntarily abandon identification papers, wedding rings, or family heirlooms when departing for a new destination. But it was the chains from the cellar that transformed the jury's expressions from concern to horror. The chains were brought into the courtroom on July 20th, each set still bolted to chunks of stone that had been removed from the cellar wall for evidence preservation. Deputy Marcus Webb testified about their discovery, describing the underground prison in detail that made several jurors visibly pale. The chains were passed among the jury members, allowing them to feel the weight of the iron, to examine the worn stone around the bolts, to understand that these implements had been used extensively over a long period. Webb's testimony included measurements showing the chains were exactly long enough to allow a person to lie down but not to reach the cellar stairs, a detail demonstrating deliberate design for imprisonment. The defense's weak suggestion that the chains might have been used for livestock was demolished when Thornton asked the defense attorney to explain why livestock would be kept in manacles bolted into an underground stone room. Samuel Cobb's testimony on July 22 provided the prosecution with undeniable evidence of premeditation. The traveling salesman brought with him 6 years of sales receipts, each one signed by Ephraim Blackwood, documenting the purchase of over 1,200 pounds of lye, multiple sets of chains, locks, and manacles. Cobb's methodical records kept for business purposes had inadvertently created a timeline of preparation and ongoing supply for a murder operation. His testimony about Ephraim's explanation that the lye was for tanning hides was contrasted with expert testimony from an actual tannery operator who confirmed that the quantity purchased would be sufficient to process nearly 6,000 deer hides, a number that exceeded the entire deer population of Monroe County. The lye wasn't for legitimate business. It was for destroying evidence, and the quantity purchased corresponded chillingly with the number of suspected victims. The reading of Silas Blackwood's confession began on July 25 and continued for an entire day. The document was read aloud in its entirety by the county clerk who had transcribed it, while the jury followed along with printed copies. The courtroom fell into absolute silence as the methodical description of 6 years of abduction, imprisonment, and murder unfolded in Silas's own words. The confession described the selection process, the luring of victims to the isolated property, the use of the cellar as a prison, and the disposal methods employed to hide the crimes. Several spectators left the courtroom during the reading, unable to stomach the clinical description of horror. The confession included Silas's quotations of Ephraim's philosophy about ownership and rights, statements that revealed premeditated ideology rather than impulsive violence. When the reading concluded, the defense made no attempt to challenge the confession's authenticity or voluntariness, having no grounds to do so, given the multiple witnesses who had observed its creation. Ephraim Blackwood took the stand in his own defense on July 27 against his attorney's advice, believing his charisma could sway the jury despite the overwhelming evidence. His testimony was a disaster that sealed his fate. Rather than expressing remorse or claiming innocence, Ephraim attempted to justify his actions through the same twisted logic Silas had described in his confession. He argued that his family had settled the hollow, that they had made it safe and productive, and that this granted them certain unspoken rights recognized by mountain tradition. His statement that a man's land is his kingdom, and what happens within his borders is his business alone, was met with audible gasps from the courtroom. When Thornton asked him directly about the women's personal effects found in the hope chest, Ephraim's response demonstrated complete absence of normal human empathy. "They came to my land seeking something from me. I took what they brought. That's trade, counselor. That's how business works in the mountains." The prosecution's closing argument on July 29 required only 30 minutes to summarize what had been proven beyond any doubt. Thornton walked the jury through the evidence systematically, the ledger entries documenting acquisitions, the commercial receipts proving premeditation, the hope chest containing proof of at least 12 victims, the cellar chains showing long-term imprisonment, the skeletal remains of 7 confirmed murder victims, Silas's detailed confession corroborating every piece of physical evidence, and Ephraim's own courtroom admission that he believed he had the right to take what he wanted from women who entered his land. The summation concluded with a statement that appeared in every newspaper account of the trial. These men didn't commit crimes of passion or acts of temporary insanity. They built a system, supplied it, operated it for 6 years, and kept meticulous records of their evil. They are not criminals who lost control. They are businessmen who turned murder into commerce. Justice demands the ultimate penalty. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. On July 30th, 1904, they returned with a verdict that surprised no one who had witnessed the trial: guilty on all 7 counts of murder for both Ephraim and Silas Blackwood. The sentencing hearing was held immediately, and Judge Thorne delivered a statement that would be preserved in court records as one of the most severe condemnations ever pronounced from a Tennessee bench. He described the crimes as representing evil of such calculated and sustained nature that it defies the comprehension of civilized society, and noted that the evidence presented had been so overwhelming in its completeness that no reasonable person could question the verdict. Both brothers were sentenced to death by hanging, the execution scheduled for November 15th, 1904.